Uh, Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm afraid we've gathered you here under false pretenses. This is Alan Bennett, so that at least we can provide. But we're not going to talk about people because we both think there's been enough talk about people. So instead, I'm going to ask Alan questions about his entire career as a playwright, and hopefully prompt him into talking about his plays in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, as well as his more recent plays. So I'm going to start by asking, Beyond the Fringe, how much of Beyond the Fringe did you write? How confident were you as a writer on Beyond the Fringe?
I think I wrote, Peter wrote the most, Peter Cook. Jonathan recycled stuff that he'd written already. Dudley didn't write anything other than the music, so I suppose I was about third. I was third on the list, as it were. But I was far from confident about the stuff I'd written. And you had, they were all comedians, so you had to fight for the stuff that you'd written, really. I wrote most of the sketch that ends the first half, which is called Aftermath of War, which Peter didn't like particularly. He tended to fall back on. He didn't really like anything hard-edged, and he tended to fall back on the sort of fantasy and stuff about newts and stuff like that. And then I did a thing which the others called the boring old man sketch, which was I thought of as being very worthy and very satirical, and I think I was talking about South Africa, and it was very boring, but they put up with that. We did the thing that, in retrospect, I regret was how we undervalued Dudley's performance. Really, only because none of us really were particularly musical, and Dudley had always to be pushed into doing things, so that the parodies he did of Benjamin Britten, for instance, he only did that, I think, 2 or 3 days before the show opened. He only wrote it. But he always felt his contribution had been undervalued, and he was quite right. I mean, not only but also, they'd always ended with Dudley at the piano and Peter sort of standing by the piano, sort of lying along. And that really was absolutely Peter's attitude to Dudley's music, really. I was never so happy when we stopped and I found I could do things on my own. I didn't think I would be able to do stuff on my own, but I was glad when to find that I could actually write on my own.
So when did you first think you could write a play?
I tried to write a play when we were in New York with Beyond the Fringe between 1962 and 64. And I started, really out of homesickness, I think, writing a play about a school and about a state school, such as I'd gone to. And I sent it, the rough draft of it, to Peter Bridge, who was an impresario then. And he encouraged me. He didn't say it was rubbish, which I think it was. But then when I came back to England from New York, I put it on one side. And that really, in retrospect, was, although it was nearly 50 years later or 40 years later, was the origin of the History Boys, really. Because, I mean, History Boys was a play about a state school, and as this one was. But I'd, in the interval, learned how to write plays. But I think the first time I used to write sketches for Ned Sherrin's late night shows, which not that was the week that was, but the ones that succeeded that. And some of them I felt had more of a permanent life than a television Saturday night. I mean, I did a parody of T. Lawrence and one of Virginia Woolf, and I began to see that I could maybe shape them into something. And also do something which we'd never done in Beyond the Fringe. There was no point in Beyond the Fringe where there was any ambiguity between it being funny or being sad. It was always had to be funny, and I wanted to do things that were both funny and sad, and so I began collecting stuff, and then in 1967 I wrote 40 Years On, or put together 40 Years On, which was again a play about a school, but it was a public school. But it was a play that looked back on English cultural history, I suppose, from between 1900 and 1940. And parts of it were quite lyrical and over-lyrical probably, but I sent it to, first of all, I was walking on Primrose Hill and Frith Banbury, who was an old-fashioned theatre producer, saw me and stopped me and asked me what I was doing, and I said about the play, and he asked to see it, and so I sent it to him. Previously, I'd sent it to Kenneth Tynan, who was here as a dramaturg for the National Theatre, or for the Old Vic, and he said, which I think this was a standard put-off, it's a commercial play, you shouldn't waste it on us. And so anyway, I then showed it to Frith Banbury, and he thought it would work in the West End, but he didn't have the resources to put it on, so he gave it to, or suggested I give it to Stoll Theatres, which was Prince Littler. And they did want to put it on, though Prince Littler, I'm sure, never read it. But and Toby Rowland was the moving spirit there, and he suggested they ask Gielgud to do it, and I never conceived that Gielgud would be interested in it, but he was, and so he. Although there were a lot of, as there always were with John, there were a lot of toings and froings, and he losing his confidence and saying, "Oh no, I don't think I'll do it," and then deciding he would do it, but he eventually did do it, and eventually did it very well, though it was hair raising really. He never learned his words until the last minute, or at that time he didn't. And we opened in Manchester on tour, and he really knew only half the script. And he would actually forget the names of the other characters on the stage. And just say, "Oh, no, yeah, yes." And I was shocked because we played in the Palace Theatre, which I think is now the big opera theatre in Manchester, and there were about sometimes no more than 30 or 40 people in the audience, even though it was Gielgud, who they were not used to seeing. But he was totally unconcerned that this audience, however small it was, saw him making a fool of himself. He didn't count it as being a real audience. It was for him just a rehearsal in which some people had come in, and so we're unembarrassed by it. And then we went to Brighton, where friends of his began to come in, and quite grand people like Diana Duff Cooper and Enid Bagnold and Cyril Connolly. And he then began to pull his socks up a bit, and also that there was more laughter in Brighton than there'd been in Manchester, not surprisingly. And so you then began to see it might work, but it was only just really ready when we came into the Apollo. And the crucial thing was that the last preview, Noel Coward came. And Noel Coward went to his dressing room afterwards, and famously he used to shake his finger at people. He said, "It's a very good play," and this gave Gielgud enormous confidence, and he did a very good performance on the first night, and then everybody was pleased because they rediscovered him as a comic actor, which they'd forgotten. I mean, he'd previously been here or at the Old Vic doing Oedipus, where with Peter Brook, and where there weren't many laughs. Well, there were laughs, but they weren't actually in the script. I mean, there was famously there were supposed to be people dying of the plague in the play, and there were people tethered to the uprights of the balconies, meant to be the dying people of Thebes, and but the audience didn't, not surprisingly, didn't gather this when they came in, and asked them for programs. And then Irene Worth was in it, and she wasn't really famous for her sense of humour. And there was a tiny little kind of pyramid on the stage on which she was supposed to impale herself finally. And one rehearsal, she couldn't find it, and she said, "Oh, where's my plinth? Where is my plinth?" And Gielgud said, "Do you mean Prince Philip or Prince Charles?" And I think Peter Brook was very sharp with him about this, because it wasn't Peter Brook's notion of the theatre at all. But anyway, he was delightful to work with, because he was a real gent. I only once saw him lose his temper, and he apologised immediately afterwards, and that was because one of his props had been misplaced. But he was wonderful to work with, and he'd no doubts ever that he was the one person the audience would watch. It didn't matter what all the kids were doing, and they were messing about. They were quite difficult. And a lesser actor would be trying to suppress the other activities. He didn't bother. He just knew that people would watch him. And he was wonderful to just to watch him, and also to see, which I'd been told about, how quickly he could turn it on and off. I mean, that he could be wreathed in tears as he was at the end of the first act, which is a memoir of the First War, and then come off stage and it would all be, no feeling for it at all, really. It was, and it's what he called the terry tears. He could just turn it on.
And the young actors in 40 Years On, yeah, they had careers subsequently almost as distinguished or as distinguished as the History Boys, did they not?
Well, George Fenton, who writes, he's written music for most of my plays, but he also wrote the music for Gandhi and for all David Attenborough's series. And then most recently come to fame is Keith McNally, who's the proprietor of Balthazar, the new posh restaurant in Covent Garden. So yes, they
Anthony Andrews, was he?
And Anthony Andrews was in it. That's right. But it was a lovely time. We ran for a year, and it was really nice.
Then after 40 Years On, the next play was Getting On, was it not?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was less happy, I'm afraid. But it was only, I look back on, I didn't get on with Kenneth Moore, who was playing a Labour MP. I mean, the fact he was playing a Labour MP was surprising, because he was quite right-wing. And he was being brought up in the commercial theatre where the star dictated everything, which Gielgud never did. He wasn't like that. But Kenneth More wanted to cut the script, and I was too green, really, to sort of negotiate that and to be tactful about it. And he did eventually ban me from the theatre. So I wasn't allowed to go to rehearsals. And there was a quite funny side to this, because the designer was Julia Trevelyan-Oman, who at that time was courting, I don't know how else you would describe it, Roy Strong. And she was a very, very conscientious designer, but she'd been so swept off her feet by this romantic thing that she really wasn't really interested in the design of this house. And eventually I had to bring down books and pictures and whatnot from my own house, which I then had to smuggle into the theatre, because I wasn't, in theory, allowed to be there, you see. So it was quite funny. Looking back on that, I read some of it the other day, and I realized that I was so, in the way I suppose young playwrights are, I wrote immensely long speeches for the actors, which I wouldn't inflict on an audience, and I wouldn't inflict on actors today. I would make it much more. Oh, it's one of the things I've learned from you, probably. To keep it short, and at that time I just let it rip, and it did well enough, did the play, but it's not one I look back on with any nostalgia.
But the next two plays were with Alec Guinness, Habeas Corpus and The Old Country.
They both did very well, but Alec was. Again, I was really surprised. They were directed by Ronald Eyre, and Ron had worked with Alec before, and so he went to him with this play, and Alec saw something in it that he liked, and I think it was Habeas Corpus is really about lust and the body, and he's a kind of I don't know it. The last line isn't, but it used to be, he whose lust lasts longest. And somehow that appealed to Alec, I don't know why. But anyway, he decided he wanted to do it. And we rehearsed it in the basement of the St. James's Piccadilly, the church. And it was a good rehearsal period, and the other person who was in it, who people would have heard of, was Andrew Sachs. This was pre-Fawlty Towers, and we opened in Oxford, and it's difficult to explain because the plot's so complicated. But Andrew Sachs played a falsy fitter. I mean, a man who sold false bras, as it were, and he had to come on it's so complicated, I can't explain. But anyway, it was an uproarious scene when he came on, and he was brilliant doing it. And the first night, he really stole the show. And the next morning, I remember walking around the Ashmolean Museum with Michael Codron, who was producing it, and Alec saying, I can't possibly go on with this at all, and wanting to be excused from doing it, really, because he didn't say that was why, but it was because Andrew Sachs, as he saw it, upstaged him totally. But eventually, he sort of came round to it and had a good time. And he said about it, it was the first time he'd ever made any money on the stage. That he'd always taken the stage to be something he did in between films, and which he did, as it were, for culture's sake. He'd never thought of it as a way of making any money. And the next play I did was again with him, called The Old Country, about a spy, a foreign office spy who'd gone to live in Russia. And again, that's got enormously long speeches in it, which, again, I wouldn't inflict today, but there are some good things in it. Anyway.
Yeah. Around this time, you were writing for television as well. When you said to me what was the first play I wrote, the first play I wrote, in a way, I remember thinking, well, I don't know how you do this. I started thinking about writing my first television play in the late 60s, I suppose. And that was a play called A Day Out, in which a group of cyclists go from Halifax to Fountains Abbey in 1911. And I had no idea how you wrote a television play. And it was going to be directed by Stephen Frears, who had no idea how you directed a television play either. So it was all what these days they would call a learning curve. But anyway, but I remember how I wrote it, which was just writing out a list of remarks and things, often things that my parents had said, or stuff that I'd heard, and stories and such like. And then assigning them, or farming them out to various characters. I had no idea about the characters, and I know this sounds pretentious, but I'm sure some of Shakespeare is written like that. You get lines which probably in the character they don't fit in with the character at all, but somehow they were spare, and so they got the line. But anyway. It worked, and I always remember the Brian Glover, who was in it, who was an all-in wrestler in his spare time, and people will remember him as the gym master or the football master in Kes. Who plays football with the boys and takes it very seriously. Anyway, no, it wasn't him. I'm telling you a lie. It was Paul Shane, who was in another television series. But Paul Shane he got to Fountains, and he had to. There's a lovely shot of the Fountains Abbey, and he had to get off his bike and say, "My bum's numb," and he couldn't say it right. He said, "My bum's numb," implying that there could have been some other part that could be numb. And because I was very green and didn't know that you didn't do this with actors, I tried to tell him that's not the way to say it. You see, to say, "My bum's numb," that's what he should have said. And he could never say it right, partly because I'd told him what to say, how to do it. And of course, I learned that you're supposed to do this through the director, and the director would tell them how to say it. But although some actors still do like to be told, don't they? I mean, they do, and I'd never had any problem with you saying how the line should go. But
some
it is
directors
actually
would.
It is a convention, honoured often in the breach, that nobody gives an actor a line reading. They have to discover it for themselves. But as soon as you do start giving actors line readings, when you think, I'm old enough now just to say that's wrong, do it this way, you realise what a relief it is to them. You go around the houses, how do you really feel about your bum? Which is what they teach you at directing school. But we were back at Fountains Abbey probably with exactly the same shots for the History Boys, weren't we?
Yeah, with the History Boys.
Yeah.
And that's one of the pleasures of filming or being in the theatre or wherever, that you actually can go in these places when there's nobody else there, and it is magical.
Yeah. Do you think those early television films that you made could be made nowadays? Do you think anybody would commission them?
Well, that nearly didn't get commissioned because my producer was a lovely man called Innes Lloyd, And Innes took it to the head of the department and gave her the script, and she said, "Well, I don't think we want to do this. It doesn't go anywhere." And he said, "Well, it goes to Fountains Abbey and back." Anyway, and he was really good with Innes because he somehow got it made. But these days it would involve accountants and going through enormous performance before you actually got permission to do it. But in those days, you know, they were doing plays so often that it was almost a routine. You know, you didn't actually have to ask permission almost.
Yeah. After The Old Country, I think the next play was Enjoy,
Yeah.
which was revived very successfully a couple of years ago, but the first time through was tricky, yes?
Disaster. John Playwright was in it, and so Laurence Olivier was in attendance sometimes. And I remember at the dress rehearsal, which was fairly dreadful, and even, dreadful partly my fault, because it was far too long for a start, and it should have been cut. But Laurence Olivier stood up in the stage box and said, "This is the best play I have ever seen." And I knew that it was going to be a disaster. But it turned out all right in the end. But it was the people didn't like it then because it wasn't naturalistic, really. And it was the first thing I'd ever done which wasn't. And it's also about the North, which at that time, well, the only person who'd written about the North on stage was David Storey, and his plays were much better. But anyway, I'm so glad it was revived and turned out well.
Yeah. And then Kafka's Dig.
Yeah.
And you also wrote a television film about Kafka, did you not?
And both of them, again, as I've said, both the same. I was still writing enormous speeches, enormous long speeches. They're both quite bleak. But the Kafka's Dig is a comedy, more about as much about biography as about Kafka. And The Insurance Man, which is a television play, is bleaker still, really. And it's awful, really, because I wouldn't, if you said something to me about Kafka, I wouldn't be interested. And it's awful the way you get interested in something, you write a play about it, and then you move on. And you feel it's evidence of triviality of mind, really, but it isn't. You just somehow writing these two plays answered something that I was interested in at that time, and then, if you wanted me to take part in something here about Kafka, I wouldn't want to do. I wouldn't be interested. Yeah.
I think the next stage plays you wrote.
You're the next.
I think it was the Double Bill.
Oh, no, the Double Bill. That's right.
That, and then Wind in the Willows, which was
sheer joy.
Yeah, it was a big stroke of luck for me. I mean, I can remember saying to Richard Eyre, I'd quite like to do a big family show, and I was thinking The Wind in the Willows, and Richard said, well, he'd already talked to you about a play about Kenneth Grahame.
Yeah.
And I think at the same time, you had just recorded that wonderful radio Wind in the Willows as well.
The play he talked to me about he wanted to mix scenes from Wind in the Willows with scenes from Kenneth Grahame's life. And I knew nothing of Kenneth Grahame's life at that time. And then read about it and found that it was appallingly sad. He, as a boy, he'd wanted to go to university, wanted to go to Oxford. His parents either couldn't afford it or didn't want him to go and put him into the Bank of England, where he did very well. He became, I think, chief cashier. But he was, so he was obviously a lot about him. And he did a bit of writing on the side. he then married and had a son, and the son was disabled and was half blind, I think, and it was to this boy that he told the stories which became Wind in the Willows. But the boy was unhappy, and but Graham projected onto him all his own aspirations, as parents tend to do, and so although I don't think the boy wanted to go and probably wasn't intellectually equipped to go, he went to Oxford, as Graham had wanted to do. But when he was at Oxford, he went out and lay down on the railway line across Port Meadow and killed himself. After which, and this is the awful thing, their marriage, which had been rather tottering, became much stronger and they were much happier. And I couldn't see how you could mix this in with Wind in the Willows without it being so gloomy. And so I said no to Richard Eyre, and then you asked me about doing the play itself. But I was quite nervous at the time because you worked in a way that I'd never been able to work. That's to say, we didn't exactly. We started off with a script, but it wasn't the script we ended up with, and a lot of it was rewritten as we went along, which I'd never been able to do really with anybody else, but which was the way we've always done really since. So that was a great breakthrough for me and a revelation, really.
I can remember that was partly to do with who we had in the room, because that first time through, the first time we did it, the chief weasel and Norman, the deputy weasel, were Tim McMullen and Adrian Scarborough.
Right, yeah.
And they were so good that you just wanted more stuff for them, didn't you? They didn't really have very much in the original script.
Yeah.
And they were very good. They realized early on that they were liked. Yeah. And so they used to just kind of lurk at the back of the room when they thought there might be more lines going in.
But the same applied with George III, which came straight afterwards. I mean that Nigel, once one saw what Nigel was going to do, you then could write round him and write more scenes for him, and that also was sheer joy, really.
Yeah. We've got halfway through. The other half has mostly been on this stage, so maybe we'll do the second half at some other time. But meanwhile, I think I should, since we said we were going to talk about people, if you want to ask questions about people, that's fine. But if you want to ask about Alec Guinness and John Gielgud and Laurence Olivier, you can do that too, or indeed Alan Bennett. So let's take some questions, and I will repeat the question when it's come. Sir.
Having done all you've done, what inspires you now?
Having done all you've done, what inspires you now?
Inspires isn't really the word. I mean, if I didn't work, I wouldn't know what to do. So I'm getting slower, but I do go and sit at the table, every day, and you know, there are actors you think of you'd like to work with, and you think of trying to write things for them. But at the moment, I haven't got anything new that I'm working on. But I go and turn my papers over and write a line here and a line there. There does come a point when you've somehow got more of a sheaf of papers and you think, oh, this might make a play. And so I'm at that stage. It's the most difficult stage before you actually have decided what you're going to do.
Yes.
I just want to say happy birthday to you.
Sorry?
She wants to say happy birthday.
Oh, thank you very much. I don't mind so long as you don't sing.
Is there anybody upstairs? Yes.
I'm wondering whether you
Where do you place yourself these days? Well, I go to Yorkshire every fortnight, so I never feel, and I get restless if I don't go. I couldn't live up there. The village where my parents retired, where I've still got a cottage, is very quiet. And in theory, I ought to be able to work there, but I can't work there. I need to be in a place where I'm likely to be interrupted, and that's down here, really. But I still call it going home. So you know, going north is going home. But I don't have much patience with the E-bar gum school, you know.
Yes.
Do you have any habits or rules that you stick to when you're writing?
Do you have any habits or rules that you stick to when you're writing?
No, I write with a pen, and then I go onto a typewriter. Though I'm getting old, so that I get arthritic if I'm a long time on the typewriter, and it's not an electric typewriter. I got a computer thinking the keyboard was much lighter, and that would be all right. But then the computer got stolen, and so I've not replaced it. But it's not a habit really, or a superstition. But I don't want to see it in print too early. If I see it in a display, as it were, printed out what I've been writing, it seems finished too soon, and so I'd much prefer to work on a freehand on a piece of paper and can cross-reference and put things in the margin and so on. And people say, oh, well, you could do that on a computer, but it's not the same. I also like the physical look of a manuscript. You know, I like what it looks like, and with all the notes and jokes and whatnot left in.
Yes.
Would you say there's a golden rule for successful collaboration?
Would you say there's a golden rule for successful collaboration?
Well, I don't know. If there is, I don't want to know it. People often say, well, why do we work so well together? I don't know why, and I don't really want to know why, because if one knew why, you probably couldn't. It wouldn't work. I have no idea why we work so well together, because we don't know each other all that well. We don't see each other socially very much, and I don't know. And maybe Nick knows much more than I do, as it were, and manages me very well. But I never feel that at all. What I feel still is I do want to please him with the scripts I write, and it is like showing up my homework, you know. And I feel pleased if he likes what I've written. And I've never really, no other directors I've worked with has been like that quite. And I've not had such a good time as I have in the last 20 years working here. Really.
I see, because I see a lot of collaborations, obviously, between actors and directors, between directors and writers, and I'm involved in them. From a director's point of view, you've got to admire, love the play, the writing, that it's your job to bring to life. That almost goes without saying. You've got to feel that in some way, whatever it's trying to say, you're very happy to say too. you maybe have an intuition that you can pull out of it something that is latent and not obviously on the surface. I think it would be hard for a director and writer to work together, and I've seen this and its opposite, to work together if they don't actually like and enjoy each other's company and like and enjoy the way each other's works. I don't think there's a mystery about it, but I have been here at the National kind of piggy in the middle when directors and writers have fallen out. And the result is never great. It's, there is always something unhappy, uneasy that finds its way onto the stage. And there's no point, I think, as a director, particularly when you get to the stage where you have a little bit of choice about what you're doing, there's no point in doing something merely professionally, merely because you've been asked to do it. It's a long time since I, as a director, got anywhere close to that, and the results were not good. So I think it's not a mystery. It's probably about it's not unlike a collaboration in any area of life. Anyway, another question. At the back there, yes.
Yeah, I'd just like Alan to say why you reject the tag of national treasure. I agree with you on that, but if you could just reiterate why you always bristle against the tag of national treasure when that comes up.
Why do you reject the accolade of national treasure? Why do you bristle?
I don't bristle, it just embarrasses me, that's all. I mean, I came to the matinee of this house yesterday, and I was sitting in my seat, and a woman came along and said, "Oh, we're in the same row as a national treasure." And I pretended not to hear. I just, I don't know. I just don't feel it anyway. I don't feel that. That's what I am really. I'm glad people like my stuff, obviously, and I'm glad people feel able to speak to me, and I'm glad I get a lot of feedback from people who, you know, it's because I'm such a timid-looking person, you know, can feel they can come up to me and say, and all that I relish and feel fortunate, because I don't think other playwrights get it in quite the same way. It's nothing to do with their quality, it's just to do with people know my face, and, you know, and I'm approachable. But I don't want to be on any kind of pedestal at all.
I think we've probably got time for two more quick ones, yes.
Speaking of national treasures, I think some years ago you presented a radio program, and perhaps a live performance as well, of Philip Larkin's poetry. Mm-hmm. Do you know any funny stories about him?
Yeah, it was here. It was the first time I had ever appeared here at the National. And I did a program put together by Patrick Garland, who last died about a month ago. But Patrick put together a program called Down Cemetery Road of Larkin's poetry. And Alan Bates normally did it, only for some reason Alan couldn't do it that time. And so Patrick asked me to do it. The National didn't advertise the fact I was doing it rather than Alan Bates. And I felt when I went on the stage that, you know, there were people expecting to see Alan Bates as he'd been wrestling half naked with Oliver Reed. And I'd fallen off a bit since then. But anyway, and also another comic thing about it was I was going through some complicated dentistry, and I'd asked the dentist that morning whether the anaesthetic would have worn off, you see. And he said, "Oh, yes, no, it will have worn off." Of course, it hadn't worn off. And I'd be reading this rather somber poetry, and suddenly I'd hit a nerve in my mouth and go, "Yeah!" So it was a very peculiar poetry reading. But about Larkin himself, I don't really know any funny stories other than, you know, the stories everybody knows about him. He didn't care for me, really, because I'd once taken part in a South Bank show about him, in which I said only complimentary things, but that was as big an insult to him as the reverse, really. I still think his poetry is wonderful, but alas, I don't really have any funny stories about it. I'll probably think of one on the way home.
And one last question. Yes.
You talked about developing plays in rehearsal, and I like very much in History Boys the use of the video of the teaching scenes in the school that happened during the set changes. And I wondered how that came about. Was that written as part of the script, or did that develop as a collaborative idea?
That's talking about plays developing in rehearsals. The video sequences in the History Boys that covered the scene changes, was that in the script, or was that...
That is entirely Nick's idea. No, well, I'm very glad to be able to say so, because it also illustrates something about our collaboration, because when we were rehearsing the History Boys, we had the actual screens that we used in the rehearsal room to the classroom dividers, as it were, and I'd assumed these were just rehearsal props. And at one point I said, they're a bit slow moving these things about. We aren't going to be using these, are we? And he said, oh no, these are the actual things. And I thought, oh Lord, this is going to be a slow job. So, but nobody enlightened me about the videos. But when I raised it with Nick, he said, oh, don't worry, it'll be all right. And I must have had absolute faith, because I didn't worry about it. And then they went off one weekend, I think, to shoot these video scenes at Kidbrooke, was it?
Yeah.
And I wasn't part of that, so I didn't go. And then we had a showing of them the following week, I think the last week of rehearsal. And it was magical. It was you didn't look at the stage when the screens were being trundled about. You did actually follow the story on the screen, and nobody bothered to explain this to me. But it was a good job, because I probably wouldn't have believed it anyway. I wouldn't believe it would work. But I was as carried away by it as the audience were, and that's entirely due to Nick.
I think I did try to explain it to you. I realized you were glazing over because I wasn't really explaining it very well. So I did say it'll be fine, but I remember you were asking around. You asked Bob Crowley, the designer, what is it he's doing with this video? And Bob said to you, don't worry, it'll all be fine.
But the guy who did them, he was very good.
He was, Ben.
And very quick, wasn't he?
Yeah.
He was lovely.
Yeah. So I think we've got to vacate the stage now and let them get it ready for people. As always, I want to say thank you to Alan Bennett for this and for all the stage. Yeah.